She looked like prey the moment she stepped off the transport. Small frame, nervous eyes, clutching her medical bag like it might shield her from the world. The insurgents saw weakness where they should have seen danger. By the time they discovered what hung around her neck, 3 of their positions were already compromised, and extraction teams were closing in fast. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, looking every bit like the liability everyone expected her to be. I was part of the security detail that day, watching this tiny woman in oversized fatigues stumble down the ramp of the Chinook helicopter with all the grace of someone who'd never seen combat in her life. Her medical bag kept sliding off her shoulder, and she flinched every time a mortar round exploded in the distance, which in Helmand Province happened about every 15 minutes. The other Marines in my unit exchanged those looks you share when command sends you someone who's going to get people killed. Corporal Martinez actually rolled his eyes when she introduced herself as our new field medic, her voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. She couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds soaking wet, and her handshake felt like grabbing a sparrow. What really sealed everyone's opinion was the necklace. It caught the light as she bent to pick up her dropped medical supplies. A delicate silver chain with what looked like some kind of decorative pendant. Jewelry on a forward operating base was already unusual, but this looked expensive, personal, completely out of place in a war zone. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shook his head when he saw it, muttering something about civilians playing soldier. The base commander, Major Harrison, assigned her to the aid station with explicit instructions to stay behind the wire. No patrols, no field operations, just patch up the walking wounded and try not to get in the way. She nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to avoid anything that involved leaving the safety of the compound. Smart move, everyone agreed. Keep the liability where she can't cause any real damage. But 3 days later, everything changed. The patrol that went out that morning was supposed to be routine, a simple supply run to a village 8 clicks north. I wasn't scheduled to go, but Chen volunteered at the last minute, claiming the villagers needed medical supplies. Against his better judgment, Rodriguez approved it. "Sometimes you need a medic more than you need another rifle," he said. "Sometimes you're wrong about that calculation." The ambush happened exactly where intel said it wouldn't. We were halfway through the village when the first shots cracked overhead, sending chunks of mud brick exploding from the walls around us. The patrol scattered like we'd trained, diving for cover behind market stalls and abandoned vehicles while Rodriguez screamed coordinates into his radio. Dr. Chen hit the ground hard, her medical bag spilling open across the dusty street, supplies scattering in every direction. I found myself pressed against a concrete barrier about 20 meters from where she'd fallen, my rifle trained on muzzle flashes coming from a 2-story building to our east. The firing was disciplined, coordinated, nothing like the wild spray we usually got from Taliban fighters. These guys knew what they were doing, and they had us pinned down good. Martinez was bleeding from his shoulder, cursing in Spanish while he tried to reload his weapon one-handed. Corporal Williams wasn't moving at all. The worst part was watching Chen in the middle of it all. She'd managed to crawl behind an overturned cart, but she was completely exposed from at least 2 angles. Every few seconds, rounds would snap past her position, kicking up dust and debris. She kept trying to reach her scattered medical supplies, probably thinking about Williams, but every time she moved, the firing would intensify. It was like watching someone try to cross a highway during rush hour. Rodriguez was on the radio, calling for extraction, but the closest support was 30 minutes out. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours when you're taking effective fire from prepared positions. The lieutenant's voice crackled through the static, asking for casualty reports and tactical assessments, but we were too busy trying not to become casualties ourselves to provide much useful information. That's when the insurgents made their move. 3 of them broke from the building, moving fast and low, heading straight for Chen's position. They'd obviously identified her as the easiest target, probably figured they could grab the medic and use her as leverage. Standard terrorist playbook, take the weakest link and make everyone else's decisions for them. I tried to shift position to get a clear shot, but they had good covering fire keeping us pinned. The first insurgent reached her position before any of us could react. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a mix of civilian clothes and military gear that suggested he'd been fighting for a while. He grabbed Chen by the arm, yanking her up from behind the cart while his partner kept their rifle trained on our positions. She didn't resist, didn't fight back, just went limp like a rag doll. Exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd never been in this situation before. But then something strange happened. As he dragged her toward the building, Chen stumbled, fell to her knees, and when he pulled her back up, she was looking directly at me. Not panic in her eyes, not terror, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like calculation. For just a second, I thought I saw her nod, almost imperceptibly, like she was acknowledging something I couldn't understand. The insurgents hauled her into the building, disappearing through a doorway on the ground floor. The firing slackened off immediately, probably because they'd achieved their objective. Now they had a hostage, which changed the entire tactical situation. No more close air support, no more artillery, no more anything that might hurt their bargaining chip. Rodriguez was already coordinating with the lieutenant, trying to figure out how to handle a hostage situation with limited resources and no specialized personnel. The standard protocol was to establish a perimeter and wait for negotiators, but we didn't have negotiators. We had 8 Marines, 2 of them wounded, and a medic who'd just become the enemy's primary asset. What happened next still doesn't make complete sense to me, even now. We heard shouting from inside the building, angry voices speaking Pashto too fast for me to follow. Then there was a scream, high-pitched and terrified, definitely female. Chen's voice. After that, an odd kind of silence fell over the entire area, like someone had turned down the volume on the whole war. Martinez managed to work his way closer to the building, using a drainage ditch for concealment. He reported back that he could see movement in the upper windows, shadows moving back and forth, but no clear targets. The insurgents were keeping their heads down, probably trying to figure out their next move now that they had a hostage to manage. 20 minutes passed with no communication from inside the building. Rodriguez tried using a bullhorn to establish contact, but got no response. The silence was worse than the shooting had been, because at least when they were firing, we knew they were still thinking tactically. Silence meant they were planning something, and with a hostage involved, our options were getting narrower by the minute. Then we heard more shouting, but this time it sounded different. Urgent. Almost panicked. The voices were coming from multiple locations inside the building now, like people were running around, searching for something. There was another scream, but shorter this time, cut off abruptly. After that, nothing but the distant sound of helicopters getting closer. I was checking my ammunition when Martinez grabbed my shoulder and pointed toward the building. The front door was opening slowly, cautiously. One of the insurgents appeared in the doorway, but he wasn't carrying a weapon. His hands were raised above his head, and he was shouting something in broken English. Surrender, I think, or maybe he was trying to negotiate. Rodriguez responded through the bullhorn, ordering him to step out with his hands visible and get on the ground. The insurgent complied immediately, dropping to his knees in the street with his arms stretched out to his sides. He kept looking back at the building, terror written all over his face, like he was more afraid of whatever was behind him than he was of us. 2 more insurgents emerged from the building, both with their hands raised, both looking like they'd seen something that had fundamentally changed their perspective on the situation. They joined their companion on the ground, lying face down in the dust while Rodriguez covered them with his rifle. Still no sign of Chen, and no explanation for why 3 armed insurgents had suddenly decided to surrender. The 4th man came out differently. He wasn't surrendering, he was fleeing. Sprinting from the building like something was chasing him, looking back over his shoulder with pure panic on his face. He made it maybe 50 meters before Martinez put him down with a single shot. Clean center mass, textbook marksmanship. The man hit the ground and didn't move again. That's when Dr. Chen walked out of the building. Not stumbled, not crawled, not supported by anyone else. Walked. Calm, composed, carrying her medical bag like she was making rounds at a hospital back home. There wasn't a mark on her, no signs of violence or struggle. She looked around at the 3 insurgents lying in the street, stepped over one of them, and headed straight toward William's position to check on his condition. Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment, then keyed his radio to report the situation to command. Hostile surrender. 1 enemy KIA. American personnel accounted for and apparently unharmed. But his voice carried a question mark that none of us could quite articulate. Something had happened in that building. Something that had turned a hostage situation into a mass surrender in less than 30 minutes. Chen was already working on Williams, checking his pulse and examining what looked like a head wound from debris or shrapnel. Her hands were steady, professional, completely focused on the medical emergency in front of her. She didn't look like someone who'd just been held captive by armed insurgents. She looked like someone who'd been briefly delayed from doing her job. The helicopter extraction arrived 15 minutes later, right on schedule. Williams was stabilized and loaded first, followed by Martinez and his shoulder wound. The 3 surrendered insurgents were zip-tied and prepared for transport to the detention facility at Bagram, standard operating procedure for prisoners captured during combat operations. I was helping load equipment when I noticed Chen's necklace again. The pendant was catching the rotor wash from the helicopter, spinning and flashing in the afternoon sunlight. Up close, it didn't look like jewelry anymore. The surface was covered with tiny markings, numbers and symbols etched into the metal with microscopic precision. Too small to read without magnification, too detailed to be decorative. Rodriguez saw me staring and moved closer for a better look. His expression changed immediately, the way people's faces change when they realize they've been looking at something important without understanding what they were seeing. He reached for his field glasses, focusing on the pendant as it continued to spin on its chain. The markings weren't random decorative elements. They were coordinates. GPS coordinates, elevation markers, distance calculations, all engraved in script so fine it would have required specialized equipment to create. Dozens of them, covering every surface of the pendant like a miniaturized reference manual for someone who needed to know exactly where things were located. But it wasn't just coordinates. There were radio frequencies, call signs, tactical symbols indicating unit strengths and equipment types, intelligence information that would normally be classified at levels requiring security clearances and need-to-know authorizations. The kind of information that could get people killed if it fell into the wrong hands, or save lives if it was used correctly. Rodriguez lowered his field glasses and looked at Chen with completely different eyes. She was still working on Williams, oblivious to our scrutiny, focused entirely on keeping him stable until they reached the surgical facility. Her small hands moved with absolute confidence, performing procedures that most medics would hesitate over, making decisions that suggested far more experience than her apparent age and background should have provided. The helicopter pilot was making final preparations for departure when Rodriguez pulled me aside. His voice was barely audible over the rotor noise, but his words cut through everything else like a blade through silk. "That's not medical jewelry," he said, still staring at Chen's necklace. "That's a targeting system." The implications hit me like cold water. If Rodriguez was right, then everything we thought we knew about Dr. Chen was wrong. The nervous, inexperienced medic, who'd stumbled off the transport 3 days ago, was carrying intelligence assets that could compromise or support operations across the entire theater. The question was whether she was supposed to have them, or whether she'd acquired them through means that would interest people with very serious security clearances. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Williams toward medical treatment and the rest of us toward a debriefing that was going to raise more questions than it answered, I found myself thinking about the way Chen had looked at me during the ambush. That moment of eye contact, the almost imperceptible nod, the sense that she was acknowledging something I hadn't understood at the time. Maybe she hadn't been as helpless as she'd appeared. Maybe the stumbling, nervous medic routine had been exactly that. A routine designed to make people underestimate her capabilities and ignore her presence. Maybe the insurgents who'd grabbed her hadn't captured a valuable hostage. Maybe they'd walked into a trap that had been waiting for someone exactly like them to spring it. The flight back to base gave me time to think about everything that had happened, everything that didn't quite add up, the way the insurgents had surrendered without negotiation, the panic in their voices before they came out with their hands raised, the fact that Chen had emerged from the building completely unharmed, despite being held by armed men for nearly 30 minutes. By the time we touched down at Forward Kestrel, I was starting to understand that we'd all been played by someone who was far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. The question was whether she was dangerous to us, or dangerous to the people who'd made the mistake of underestimating her. Either way, the debriefing was going to be very interesting. The debriefing room at Forward Kestrel felt smaller than usual, with Colonel Harrison pacing behind the metal table while Rodriguez and I sat across from Dr. Chen. She looked exactly the same as she had 3 days ago when she'd stepped off that helicopter. Small and unassuming, her medical bag resting at her feet like it contained nothing more dangerous than bandages and antiseptic. The only difference was the way everyone in the room was looking at her now. Colonel Harrison had been briefed on what Rodriguez observed through his field glasses, but he was having trouble reconciling the intelligence with the person sitting in front of him. Chen answered his questions with the same quiet professionalism she'd shown since arriving at the base, her voice steady and unremarkable, offering no explanation for how 3 armed insurgents had decided to surrender after taking her hostage. "Dr. Chen," the colonel began, settling into his chair with the deliberate movements of someone choosing his words carefully. "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened in that building, from the moment they grabbed you until you walked out." She nodded once, folding her hands in her lap with the patience of someone who'd expected this conversation and had prepared for it accordingly. "They dragged me inside and zip-tied my hands behind my back, standard restraint procedure. Then they started arguing about what to do next. Their Arabic was regional, probably northern Afghanistan based on the dialect patterns." Rodriguez glanced at me across the table. Most medics didn't study regional Arabic dialects as part of their medical training. Most medics couldn't identify tactical communication patterns in languages they supposedly didn't speak. Chen continued her account without seeming to notice our exchange. The older one wanted to contact their command structure before making any demands. The younger ones were more impulsive, talking about immediate leverage and psychological pressure tactics. Classic disagreement between experienced operators and recent recruits. I used the time to assess the interior layout and identify potential exit routes. Colonel Harrison leaned forward slightly. "You were gathering tactical intelligence while being held hostage." "I was trying to stay alive," Chen replied with the kind of matter-of-fact tone people used when discussing the weather. "Understanding your environment is basic survival protocol regardless of the circumstances." But that wasn't the whole story, and everyone in the room knew it. The 3 insurgents hadn't just decided to surrender because they'd had a philosophical disagreement about hostage negotiation tactics. Something had happened in that building, something that had changed the entire dynamic of the situation in ways that normal medical personnel weren't trained to accomplish. "Dr. Chen," Colonel Harrison continued, his voice taking on the formal tone that indicated we were moving into classified territory. "I need you to explain the necklace." For the first time since the debriefing began, Chen's expression shifted slightly. Not panic or concern, but the kind of careful consideration that preceded important decisions. She reached up slowly, her fingers finding the silver chain around her neck, and lifted the pendant so it caught the fluorescent light overhead. Up close, the markings were even more intricate than I'd realized. Tiny numbers and symbols covered every millimeter of the surface, etched with precision that would have required specialized equipment and considerable expertise. The pendant itself was larger than it had appeared from a distance, about the size of a silver dollar, with thickness that suggested it could hold substantial amounts of information. "This belonged to my brother," she said quietly, turning the pendant so the light revealed different sections of the engraved text. "Captain David Chen, Special Operations Command. He was killed in action 18 months ago during a classified operation in the Hindu Kush." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Colonel Harrison's posture changed immediately. Special Operations Command meant David Chen had been working at classification levels that required background investigations and security clearances that most people never even heard about. If he'd been carrying intelligence assets in the form of jewelry, then those assets had been sanctioned by people with authority to make decisions about national security. The pendant contains operational intelligence for his unit's area of responsibility, Chen continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone reciting technical specifications. GPS coordinates for hostile positions, safe house locations, radio frequencies for indigenous resistance networks, contact protocols for intelligence assets in place. Everything needed to continue operations if primary communication channels were compromised. Rodriguez was staring at the pendant like it might explode. The amount of classified information Chen was describing could compromise ongoing operations across multiple countries if it fell into hostile hands. It could also provide tactical advantages that might save American lives if it was used correctly by people who understood its significance. "Why are you carrying it?" Colonel Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand the answer. "Because someone needs to finish what he started," Chen replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time since the debriefing began. "The intelligence network he was developing is still operational, but it needs coordination and medical support to remain effective. That's why I volunteered for assignment to Forward Operating Base Kestrel. The room went completely silent, except for the distant sound of helicopters and generators that provided the constant background noise of military installations. Chen wasn't a field medic who'd been assigned to their base by coincidence. She was David Chen's sister, carrying his intelligence assets, continuing operations that officially didn't exist and couldn't be acknowledged through normal military channels. Dr. Chen, Colonel Harrison said carefully, what exactly happened to those insurgents in the building? She considered the question for a moment, her fingers still holding the pendant, where the light could illuminate its intricate engravings. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd been trained by people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. I told them exactly where their friends were positioned, down to GPS coordinates and elevation markers. I provided them with radio frequencies their commanders were using for tactical communication. I gave them detailed intelligence about American patrol routes and timing protocols that would allow them to avoid contact with superior forces. Rodriguez's jaw dropped. Chen had just confessed to providing classified information to enemy combatants, which constituted treason under any reasonable interpretation of military law. But something in her tone suggested there was more to the story than a simple case of collaboration with hostile forces. All of the information I provided was completely accurate, she continued, still holding the pendant where its markings caught the light. Every coordinate, every frequency, every tactical detail was precisely correct, based on the intelligence my brother had gathered over 18 months of operations in this region. Colonel Harrison was starting to understand, but he waited for her to complete the explanation rather than jumping to conclusions that might be wrong. Chen smiled slightly, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her since she'd arrived at the base. What I didn't mention was that all of those positions had been compromised 6 weeks ago. The radio frequencies were being monitored by intelligence services. The patrol routes had been changed after my brother's unit identified them as tactically predictable. Everything I told them was accurate, but completely useless for operational purposes. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Chen hadn't been providing intelligence to the enemy. She'd been feeding them information that would allow American forces to track their movements and predict their actions. Every coordinate she'd given them was a location where they could be found by people who specialized in making insurgents disappear permanently. More importantly, Chen continued, I was able to confirm the identities of the 3 men who captured me. Their faces are now documented, their voices are recorded on the surveillance equipment I've been carrying, and their tactical preferences have been observed under stress conditions. That information has already been transmitted to the appropriate intelligence networks for action. Rodriguez was staring at her like she'd just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Chen had been captured by enemy forces and had somehow managed to turn the entire situation into an intelligence-gathering operation that would probably result in the elimination of hostile networks across the region. The nervous, inexperienced medic we'd been protecting had been protecting us the entire time. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, processing information that would require classified briefings and secure communications to fully understand. Chen's presence at FOB Kestrel wasn't a bureaucratic accident or a personnel assignment based on medical needs. She was continuing special operations that had been initiated by her brother before his death, using resources and networks that existed outside normal military command structures. Dr. Chen, he said finally, I need to ask you directly, are you operating under official sanction? She reached into her medical bag and removed a manila envelope sealed with tape that had obviously been designed to indicate tampering. Inside were documents that I couldn't read from across the table, but Colonel Harrison's expression suggested they contained authorization at levels that most field commanders never encountered. Everything I'm doing has been approved by people whose names don't appear on organizational charts, she said, returning the documents to the envelope and sealing it again. My medical credentials are genuine, my assignment to this base was requested specifically, and my authorization to continue my brother's work comes from sources that don't normally communicate through standard military channels. The debriefing continued for another hour, but most of the important questions had been answered. Chen was exactly who she appeared to be. and simultaneously someone completely different. She was a qualified medical professional, assigned to provide healthcare services to military personnel. She was also a special operations asset continuing classified work that her brother had been killed trying to complete. When Colonel Harrison finally dismissed us, Chen gathered her medical bag and headed for the door like nothing unusual had happened. Just another routine debriefing following a contact with hostile forces, no different from dozens of others that happened every week at forward operating bases across Afghanistan. But as she reached the doorway, she paused and looked back at Rodriguez and me. "If you're wondering how those insurgents knew exactly where to set up their ambush this morning," she said quietly, "it's because I told them where we'd be and when we'd arrive. Some intelligence is only useful if the enemy acts on it in predictable ways." The door closed behind her before either of us could respond, leaving Rodriguez and me alone with Colonel Harrison, and the understanding that we'd been participants in an operation we hadn't even known was happening. The supply run to the village hadn't been routine. The ambush hadn't been a tactical surprise. Everything that had occurred had been orchestrated by someone who understood that the most effective intelligence operations were the ones where nobody realized they were being manipulated until it was too late to matter. Colonel Harrison was already reaching for the secure telephone that would connect him to people whose job was dealing with operations that officially didn't exist. Chen's presence at FOB Kestrel was going to require briefings and approvals at levels that would probably result in new protocols for handling personnel whose assignments involved classified activities. Rodriguez and I walked back to our quarters in silence, both trying to process what we'd learned about the woman we'd spent 3 days dismissing as a liability. She'd volunteered for the patrol that morning not because she wanted to help villagers, but because she'd needed to be captured by specific insurgents who would provide her with intelligence she couldn't have gathered any other way. The nervous stumbling down the helicopter ramp, the oversized fatigues that made her look helpless, the way she'd flinched at every explosion, all of it had been carefully calculated to create exactly the impression we'd formed. She'd needed everyone to underestimate her capabilities so she could operate without drawing attention to activities that needed to remain invisible. That evening, I saw Chen in the mess hall, eating alone at the same table she'd occupied since arriving at the base. Her medical bag sat beside her chair, and her necklace was visible above the collar of her uniform, catching the light exactly the way it had the first day. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but everything about the way I saw her was completely different. She was still the small, quiet medic who'd stumbled off the transport, looking overwhelmed by her surroundings. She was also a special operations asset carrying intelligence that could change the tactical situation across the entire region. Both things were simultaneously true, and both were exactly what she needed to be to accomplish objectives that most people would never know existed. The next morning, Chen was gone. Her bunk was empty, her gear removed, no forwarding information or explanation of where she'd been transferred. Colonel Harrison's only comment was that her assignment had been completed, and she'd been recalled for reassignment to locations where her particular skills were needed. But 2 weeks later, intelligence reports started coming through command channels, indicating that insurgent networks across the region were being systematically dismantled. Safe houses were being raided, communication networks were being compromised, and leadership figures were disappearing in operations that were being attributed to enhanced intelligence cooperation with indigenous resistance forces. The pendant around Chen's neck had contained more than coordinates and radio frequencies. It had contained the keys to networks that her brother had spent 18 months developing, networks that were now being activated by someone who understood exactly how to use information as a weapon, more effective than anything in our standard arsenal. Rodriguez and I never talked directly about what had happened during that debriefing, but we both understood that we'd witnessed something that changed the way we thought about the people around us. The quiet ones, the ones who seemed overwhelmed or out of place, the ones who carried themselves like they were just trying to stay out of the way. Sometimes they were exactly what they appeared to be, and sometimes they were something else entirely, something that only became visible when circumstances required them to reveal capabilities that were more dangerous than anyone had imagined. 6 months after Dr. Chen disappeared from FOB Kestrel, I found myself assigned to a joint intelligence briefing at Kandahar Airfield that would fundamentally change everything I thought I understood about her operation. The briefing room was packed with personnel from multiple agencies, people whose uniforms carried insignia I didn't recognize, and whose presence suggested this wasn't a routine information-sharing session. The briefing officer was a woman I'd never seen before, wearing civilian clothes that somehow managed to look more authoritative than most uniforms. She introduced herself as Ms. Patricia Walsh from an organization that didn't appear on any official government charts, and she began her presentation with satellite imagery that made everyone in the room lean forward in their chairs. The first image showed a compound in the mountains near the Pakistan border, a collection of buildings that intelligence had been monitoring for 18 months without being able to penetrate or fully understand. The second image showed the same compound 3 weeks later, reduced to smoking rubble with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of structural weaknesses and defensive positions. Operation Ghost Network has been the most successful intelligence penetration in this theater since 2001, Walsh announced, advancing to the next slide that showed a web of connections spanning 3 countries and involving over 200 identified personnel. The network responsible for this success was initiated by Captain David Chen of Special Operations Command and continued by assets operating under deep cover protocols that required complete operational independence. Rodriguez was sitting 2 rows behind me, and I could feel him tense up when Walsh mentioned David Chen's name. We'd both been wondering what had happened to the intelligence networks that Chen's sister had inherited, whether the coordinates and radio frequencies on her necklace had actually resulted in any meaningful operational success. The next series of slides answered those questions in ways that neither of us had anticipated. Map after map showing insurgent positions that had been compromised, communication networks that had been penetrated, supply lines that had been disrupted with surgical precision. Every operation had been coordinated through intelligence that could only have come from sources with access to information that wasn't available through normal military channels. The asset designated as Medical Officer 7 established contact with 14 separate resistance cells during a 6-month operational period. Walsh continued, her presentation revealing the scope of activities that had been occurring while we'd been conducting routine patrol operations. These contacts resulted in the identification and elimination of 47 high-value targets and the disruption of supply networks responsible for 70% of improvised explosive devices in the eastern provinces. Medical Officer 7. The designation was obviously a code name, but the operational timeframe coincided exactly with Chen's assignment to our base and her subsequent disappearance. She hadn't been recalled for reassignment to another medical facility. She'd been extracted after completing an intelligence operation that had been far more extensive than anyone at FOB Kestrel had realized. Walsh advanced to a slide showing communication intercepts, radio traffic that had been recorded and analyzed by people whose job was understanding what insurgent commanders were saying when they thought nobody was listening. The conversations revealed panic, confusion, and growing paranoia, as operational security was systematically compromised in ways that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of their procedures was feeding information to hostile forces. The most significant aspect of this operation was the asset's ability to maintain medical cover while conducting intelligence activities that required direct contact with hostile personnel. Walsh explained, her tone suggesting she was describing something that pushed the boundaries of what most people considered possible. Standard protocols require months of preparation and extensive support networks to establish this level of penetration. Medical Officer 7 accomplished it while maintaining primary duties as a field medic at a forward operating base. The briefing continued for another hour, detailing operations that read like fiction but were supported by documentation that suggested they'd actually happened. Supply convoys that had been ambushed by insurgents who'd walked into carefully prepared kill zones. Command meetings that had been compromised because someone had provided detailed intelligence about timing and locations. Communication networks that had been monitored because the encryption keys had been shared with people who specialized in intercepting and analyzing hostile traffic. When Walsh finally concluded her presentation and opened the floor for questions, the room remained silent for several long moments. Everyone present was trying to process information that challenged their understanding of how intelligence operations were supposed to work. Individual assets weren't supposed to be capable of accomplishing results that normally required teams of specialists working with extensive technological support. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison from the Intelligence Division finally raised his hand. Ms. Walsh, you're describing operational capabilities that would require years of training and preparation. How does a medical officer acquire the skills necessary to conduct this level of intelligence work? Walsh's response revealed another layer of complexity that none of us had considered. Medical Officer 7 was recruited through family connections to existing networks. Her brother's death provided both motivation and access to intelligence assets that had already been developed through 18 months of operational activity. She didn't have to build networks from scratch, she inherited them from someone who'd already established the necessary relationships. The implications were staggering. David Chen hadn't just been gathering intelligence when he'd been killed. He'd been developing networks of human assets, people who were willing to provide information and support to American forces in exchange for medical care and protection from Taliban reprisals. When his sister had inherited his pendant and its encoded coordinates, she'd also inherited relationships with people who were already committed to continuing his work. More importantly, Walsh continued, Medical Officer 7's medical credentials provided access and credibility that traditional intelligence operatives couldn't establish. People who wouldn't trust soldiers or spies were willing to trust someone who treated their children's illnesses and provided medical care without asking questions about political affiliations. Rodriguez caught my eye as we left the briefing room, both of us understanding that we'd been witnesses to something far more significant than we'd realized at the time. Chen's nervous behavior and apparent inexperience had been cover for an operation that was continuing work her brother had died trying to complete. Every stumble, every flinch at explosions, every moment of apparent vulnerability had been calculated to create exactly the impression that would allow her to operate without drawing attention to activities that needed to remain invisible. 3 days after the briefing, I received orders for a new assignment that would take me away from Afghanistan and back to the United States for advanced training. Rodriguez got similar orders, along with most of the other personnel who'd been present during Chen's time at Forward Kestrel. The coincidence was too obvious to be accidental. Someone wanted to ensure that people who'd witnessed Chen's operation were reassigned before they could discuss what they'd learned with personnel who weren't cleared for that level of information. But before I left Afghanistan, I made one final visit to the village where the ambush had occurred 6 months earlier. The building where Chen had been held by the insurgents was still standing, but it had been abandoned. Local residents told me through an interpreter that the men who'd been using it had disappeared shortly after the incident, along with several others who'd been associated with Taliban activities in the area. The village elder, an ancient man whose weathered face suggested he'd witnessed decades of conflict, invited me to share tea in his compound. Through the interpreter, he told me about a woman who'd provided medical care to children in the village, someone who'd treated illnesses that the local medical facilities couldn't handle. She'd been quiet, professional, asking no questions about politics or allegiances, just providing care to anyone who needed it. She understood things about our people that most Americans never learn, the elder said, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd observed cultural interactions for more years than most people lived. She knew which families could be trusted, which young men were angry enough to be dangerous, which women carried information that their husbands didn't know they possessed. She saw things that soldiers miss because they're looking for different kinds of truth. The interpreter's translation couldn't capture the full meaning of what the elder was trying to express, but I understood enough to realize that Chen's medical work had provided her with access to information that traditional intelligence gathering couldn't obtain. Treating sick children brought her into contact with families who would share information they'd never provide to military interrogators. Providing medical care to women allowed her to learn about social networks that remained invisible to male intelligence operatives. The men who took her made a mistake, the elder continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something that should have been obvious. They thought she was weak because she was small and quiet. They thought she was valuable because she was American. They didn't understand that she was dangerous because she knew things about them that they'd never told anyone. As I prepared to leave the village, the elder handed me a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside was a piece of metal that had obviously been cut from something larger, a fragment that contained partial engravings similar to what I'd seen on Chen's necklace. The markings were too damaged to read completely, but I could make out enough numbers to recognize GPS coordinates. She left this for someone to find, the elder explained through the interpreter. She said it contained information that might be useful for people who understood its significance. She said Americans were good at finding things when they knew what to look for. The fragment contained coordinates for locations throughout the province, places that weren't marked on any official maps but obviously held significance for people who needed to know where specific activities were occurring. Safe houses, supply caches, meeting locations, all encoded in markings so small they required magnification to read accurately. I understood then that Chen's operation had been even more extensive than the intelligence briefing had revealed. She hadn't just inherited her brother's networks and continued his work. She'd expanded them, developed new sources, established relationships that would continue providing intelligence long after she'd moved on to other assignments. The nervous medical officer who'd stumbled off the helicopter at FOB Kestrel had been carrying the seeds of an intelligence operation that would reshape the tactical situation across multiple provinces. My flight back to the United States gave me 12 hours to think about everything I'd witnessed and learned during my deployment. Chen's story had challenged every assumption I'd made about the people around me, the way strength and capability could be disguised as weakness and vulnerability. She'd taught me that the most dangerous people were often the ones you'd never suspect, the ones who carried themselves like they were just trying to stay out of the way. But more than that, she'd demonstrated something about service and sacrifice that went beyond anything they taught in military training. Her brother had died trying to build networks that could save American lives and help local populations resist Taliban oppression. Instead of grieving and moving on, she'd picked up his work and continued it, using her medical training as cover for intelligence activities that required courage most people couldn't imagine. The last time I saw Rodriguez was at the departure terminal in Kandahar, both of us waiting for flights that would take us away from Afghanistan and back to assignments where we'd probably never encounter anything like Chen's operation again. We didn't talk directly about what we'd learned, but we both understood that we'd been changed by witnessing something that redefined our understanding of what individual determination could accomplish. "You think we'll ever know the whole story?" Rodriguez asked as we waited for our boarding announcements. I thought about the fragment of metal the village elder had given me, the coordinates it contained, the networks of people who trusted a quiet American medic enough to share information that could get them killed if it fell into the wrong hands. "I think the whole story is still being written," I replied, "and most of it will probably stay classified for longer than we'll live to see it declassified." 6 years later, I'm working as an instructor at Fort Benning, teaching young soldiers about tactical awareness and threat assessment. Sometimes, when I'm explaining how assumptions can be dangerous in combat situations, I tell them about a medical officer I knew who taught me that strength doesn't always announce itself with loud voices and aggressive behavior. Sometimes it wears scrubs and carries a medical bag and treats sick children while gathering intelligence that saves American lives. I never mention names or specific locations, and I always frame it as a hypothetical scenario rather than something that actually happened. But I make sure they understand that the quiet ones, the ones who seem overwhelmed or out of place, sometimes they're exactly what they appear to be. And sometimes they're something else entirely, something that becomes visible only when circumstances force them to reveal capabilities that are more powerful than anyone imagined. The pendant Chen wore around her neck contained more than coordinates and radio frequencies. It contained the legacy of someone who died trying to make a difference, and the determination of someone who'd refused to let that sacrifice be meaningless. The coordinates led to enemy positions, but they also led to something more important, the understanding that service takes many forms, and courage doesn't always wear the uniform you expect it to wear. 15 years have passed since that deployment, and I've learned to recognize the signs in ways I never could before. The quiet confidence that doesn't need validation. The way someone moves through a room without drawing attention, while simultaneously observing everything that matters. The ability to blend into surroundings so completely that people forget you're there, which is sometimes the most valuable skill anyone can possess. I was attending a military medical conference in San Antonio when I saw her again. Dr. Sarah Chen was presenting research on trauma treatment protocols for civilian medical facilities, speaking to an audience of emergency room physicians and paramedics who hung on every word she shared about treating injuries under extreme conditions. Her presentation was clinical, professional, focused entirely on medical procedures that could save lives when resources were limited and time was critical.
She looked exactly the same as she had during that brief assignment to Forward Kestrel, small and unassuming, wearing civilian clothes that somehow managed to make her invisible in a room full of people whose job was noticing medical details. Her voice carried the same quiet authority I remembered, the tone of someone who'd learned to communicate essential information without wasting words or energy on unnecessary drama. But there were differences that became apparent as I listened to her presentation. The medical procedures she was describing weren't the kind of techniques they taught in civilian medical schools. They were battlefield medicine, trauma protocols designed for situations where evacuation wasn't possible and definitive care might be hours or days away. The kind of knowledge that came from treating injuries under conditions where making the wrong decision meant watching someone die. During the question and answer session, a young paramedic asked about treating patients in hostile environments where medical personnel might be targeted by people who viewed healthcare workers as legitimate military objectives. Chen's response revealed depths of experience that wouldn't normally be found in someone whose official biography listed only civilian medical training and brief military service as a field medic. The key to operating in hostile environments is understanding that medical neutrality is a concept that exists primarily in international law rather than tactical reality, she explained, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd learned these lessons through direct experience rather than academic study. People who want to hurt you don't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants based on the symbols you wear or the equipment you carry. They make those distinctions based on whether they perceive you as threatening their objectives. The room was completely silent as she continued, medical professionals trying to process information that challenged their understanding of how healthcare was supposed to work in crisis situations. Most of them had never considered the possibility that providing medical care might require tactical awareness and operational security protocols normally associated with military combat operations. Sometimes the most effective way to ensure patient safety is to make sure that hostile forces don't realize you're providing medical care. Chen continued, her tone remaining clinical and professional despite the subject matter. Mobile treatment protocols, covert evacuation procedures, and concealed medical facilities aren't theoretical concepts in many parts of the world. They're operational necessities for anyone who wants to continue providing healthcare in environments where being identified as medical personnel makes you a target rather than protecting you from violence. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a diagram of what appeared to be a standard medical supply kit. But as she explained the contents, it became clear that every item had been selected for dual purposes. Bandages that could serve as signal markers. Antibiotics that came in containers, designed to look like personal hygiene products. Surgical instruments that doubled as tools for other activities that she didn't specify but that everyone in the room understood, weren't strictly medical in nature. Concealment and misdirection aren't about deception for its own sake, Chen explained, her words careful and measured in ways that suggested she'd given similar presentations to audiences with higher security clearances. They're about creating operational flexibility in environments where traditional medical protocols might compromise patient safety or prevent you from providing care to people who need it most. The presentation continued for another 40 minutes, covering topics that ranged from treating gunshot wounds without access to surgical facilities to establishing temporary medical stations in buildings that might need to be evacuated quickly if security situations deteriorated. Chen's knowledge was encyclopedic, covering scenarios that most medical professionals would never encounter, but that obviously reflected real-world experience rather than theoretical preparation. When the session concluded, the audience remained seated longer than usual, asking questions that revealed how much they'd learned about medical practice under extreme conditions. Several physicians approached the speaker's platform to request copies of protocols and procedures that Chen had referenced during her presentation, resources that weren't available through normal medical education channels. I waited until the crowd around the platform had dispersed before approaching her myself. She recognized me immediately, though 15 years had passed and we'd only interacted briefly during her assignment to our base. Her smile was genuine but reserved, the expression of someone who was pleased to see a familiar face, but remained cautious about discussing experiences that might not be appropriate for civilian venues. Master Sergeant Wilson, she said, using the rank I'd held during our deployment rather than asking about my current status. I heard you're teaching now. That's important work, helping the next generation understand what they might encounter out there. We moved to a quiet corner of the conference facility where we could talk without being overheard by people whose security clearances might not extend to discussions of classified operations or intelligence activities that officially hadn't occurred. Chen carried herself with the same measured calm I remembered, but there was something different about her now, a sense of completion that suggested she'd found ways to put her unique skills to use in contexts that didn't require operating under false identities or maintaining cover stories. "Your presentation was impressive," I said, settling into a chair across from her at a small table that provided some privacy from the ongoing conversations around us. "The medical protocols you described, those aren't standard curriculum at most training facilities." Her laugh was quiet but genuine, the sound of someone who'd learned to find humor in situations that most people would consider terrifying. "Medical schools don't typically cover battlefield trauma care or operational medicine," she agreed, her tone carrying the dry humor of someone who'd discovered gaps in professional education through direct experience. "But the principles translate well to civilian emergency medicine, especially in urban environments where violence is a regular occurrence." She reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a business card that identified her as the director of a medical foundation I'd never heard of. The foundation's name was printed in simple black letters on white cardstock. No logos or graphics that might draw attention or suggest anything beyond straightforward medical services. But the address was in Washington, D.C., which suggested connections to government agencies that didn't advertise their activities through normal public information channels. "We provide medical support for people who can't access traditional healthcare systems," Chen explained, her words carefully chosen to convey information without revealing details that might compromise ongoing operations. "Refugees, undocumented immigrants, people whose circumstances make them reluctant to seek help through official medical facilities. Sometimes providing healthcare requires understanding that patients aren't always able to tell you the complete truth about how they were injured or why they need treatment." I understood immediately what she was describing. Medical care for people whose presence in the United States might be connected to intelligence operations or witness protection programs. Treatment for injuries that might raise questions if they were reported through normal emergency room protocols. Healthcare for people whose survival depended on maintaining identities that couldn't withstand detailed scrutiny from medical professionals who were required to document patient information for legal and insurance purposes. "Are you still doing the kind of work that requires pendant necklaces with encoded coordinates?" I asked, keeping my voice low enough that the question wouldn't carry to anyone who might be listening from nearby tables. Chen's expression became more serious, though she maintained the professional demeanor that had characterized her presentation. "The pendant was retired when the networks it supported were transferred to other assets," she replied, her words confirming what I'd suspected about the conclusion of her intelligence activities. "But some of the people I met during that deployment have found their way to the United States, and they occasionally need medical care from someone who understands their particular circumstances." The implications were profound. Chen wasn't just providing medical care to refugees and immigrants. She was treating people who'd been part of the intelligence networks her brother had developed, and she'd continued. People who'd risked their lives to provide information to American forces and now needed support as they adjusted to life in a country that couldn't officially acknowledge their contributions to military operations. "The Foundation handles about 300 cases per year," she continued, providing statistics that revealed the scope of her current activities. "Most of them are straightforward medical issues, treating people who can't afford insurance or who avoid traditional healthcare systems for immigration status reasons. But approximately 15% require specialized protocols because of the patient's backgrounds or the circumstances surrounding their injuries." 15% of 300 cases meant that Chen was treating roughly 45 people annually whose medical needs were connected to intelligence activities or security situations that couldn't be documented through normal healthcare channels. People who'd been shot, stabbed, beaten, or otherwise injured in circumstances that would require explanations they couldn't provide to emergency room personnel who were obligated to report certain types of trauma to law enforcement agencies. "Dr. Chen," I said, using her professional title rather than any military designation that might not be appropriate in civilian settings. "I've been teaching young soldiers about tactical awareness and threat assessment for 6 years now. Sometimes I tell them about a medical officer who taught me that assumptions can be dangerous, and strength doesn't always announce itself. Would you mind if I asked you some questions about educational approaches that might help them understand these concepts more effectively?" Her response revealed the same thoughtful consideration I remembered from our brief interactions during her deployment. Chen understood that education was an ongoing process, that the lessons she demonstrated through her actions needed to be passed on to people who might find themselves in similar situations, where understanding human nature could mean the difference between success and failure. "What specific concepts are you trying to teach them?" she inquired, her tone suggesting she was genuinely curious about how her experience had been translated into educational content for military personnel. "I thought about the students I'd worked with over the years, young men and women who were preparing for deployments where they'd encounter people whose motivations and capabilities might not be immediately apparent." The lessons Chen had taught weren't just about intelligence operations or covert activities. They were about recognizing that everyone carried stories that weren't visible on the surface, and that making assumptions based on appearances could prevent you from understanding what people were actually capable of accomplishing. The primary challenge is helping them understand that threat assessment requires looking beyond obvious indicators, I explained, organizing my thoughts around teaching objectives that had evolved through years of classroom experience. Most of them have been trained to identify threats based on visible weapons, aggressive behavior, or obvious preparation for violence. But some of the most dangerous people are the ones who look completely harmless until circumstances force them to reveal capabilities that nobody suspected. Chen nodded slowly, understanding the educational challenge I was describing. Military training traditionally focused on identifying and responding to obvious threats, but modern conflicts required more sophisticated approaches to human intelligence and behavioral assessment. The ability to recognize hidden capabilities while managing the impressions you created in others was essential for anyone operating in environments where the lines between civilian and combatant weren't clearly defined. I found that the most effective approach is using case studies that demonstrate the principle without revealing operational details, she said, her words reflecting experience with training personnel whose security clearances might not extend to classified information. Students need to understand the concepts without being exposed to specific methods or sources that could compromise ongoing activities. We spent the next hour discussing educational methodologies and training approaches that could convey complex lessons about human behavior without violating security protocols or revealing information that needed to remain classified. Chen's insights into adult learning and motivation were informed by experience with training indigenous personnel in environments where cultural misunderstandings could have fatal consequences. "The key insight isn't that people are deceptive or manipulative," she explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned these lessons through direct experience. "It's that everyone has hidden depths, and that effective communication requires understanding the difference between what people choose to reveal and what they're actually capable of accomplishing. Most people underestimate others because they make judgments based on incomplete information." Her foundation's work provided daily examples of this principle in action. Patients who appeared to be simple refugees often carried knowledge and experience that could be valuable to law enforcement or intelligence agencies. People who seemed helpless and dependent sometimes possessed skills and connections that could be essential for accomplishing objectives that required local knowledge and cultural understanding. "Last month, we treated a woman who came to us with what appeared to be domestic violence injuries," Chen said, sharing an example that illustrated the complexity of the situations her foundation encountered. Burns on her arms and hands, facial bruising, psychological trauma consistent with prolonged abuse. Standard protocol would have been to document the injuries, refer her to social services, and encourage her to press charges against her abuser. She paused, organizing her thoughts around details that needed to be shared without compromising patient confidentiality or revealing information that might endanger ongoing operations. "But during the medical examination, I noticed scarring patterns that suggested previous exposure to chemical agents, and her knowledge of wound care was more sophisticated than you'd expect from someone with her stated background." When I asked about her medical training, she eventually revealed that she'd been a nurse in Syria before fleeing to the United States. The woman hadn't been a victim of domestic violence. She'd been a medical professional who'd treated chemical weapons injuries during the Syrian civil war, and the burns on her hands and arms were from exposure to substances that were being used against civilian populations. The psychological trauma wasn't from personal abuse, it was from witnessing atrocities that most people couldn't imagine, and being forced to treat injuries that resulted from weapons that violated international law. Her knowledge of chemical exposure treatment was more current and detailed than anything available through normal medical literature. Chen continued, her words revealing the intelligence value of someone who appeared to be just another refugee seeking medical care. She developed procedures for treating injuries that American medical facilities might encounter if chemical weapons were ever used in domestic terrorist attacks. Information that could save hundreds of lives if it was shared with the appropriate emergency response agencies. But the woman couldn't share that information through normal channels because doing so would reveal her location and identity to Syrian intelligence services that were actively hunting medical personnel who'd treated opposition fighters during the Civil War. Her safety in the United States depended on maintaining a low profile and avoiding any activities that might attract attention from people whose job was tracking refugees with backgrounds in sensitive areas. Cases like hers demonstrate why specialized medical services are necessary, Chen explained, her words highlighting the complexity of providing healthcare to people whose backgrounds intersected with national security concerns. Traditional medical facilities aren't equipped to handle patients whose treatment requires understanding operational security and counterintelligence considerations. Most emergency room physicians don't know how to document medical care in ways that protect patient safety while still meeting legal requirements for reporting certain types of injuries. The conversation revealed layers of complexity in Chen's current work that paralleled the intelligence activities she'd conducted during her deployment to Afghanistan. She was still operating at the intersection of medical care and national security, still working with people whose backgrounds and capabilities weren't immediately apparent to outsiders who made judgments based on surface appearances. The most important lesson from your deployment, I said, thinking about how to summarize the educational value of her story for military personnel who might encounter similar situations, seems to be that respect and careful assessment should be the default approach to anyone you encounter, because you never know what someone might be capable of contributing or what they might know that could be valuable. Chen's response reflected years of experience working with people whose survival had depended on their ability to blend into surroundings, while maintaining capabilities that weren't visible to casual observation. Respectful curiosity is usually more productive than assumptions based on appearances, she agreed, her tone carrying the authority of someone who'd learned these lessons through direct experience. Most people are willing to share valuable information if they trust that you're genuinely interested in helping them rather than exploiting their knowledge for purposes they don't understand. When our conversation concluded, she handed me a second business card, this one containing only a phone number and an email address with no organizational affiliation or identifying information. If any of your students end up in situations where they need medical care that can't be documented through normal channels, she said quietly, or if they encounter people who might benefit from the kind of healthcare services that understand operational security requirements. I understood that she was offering something more than emergency medical treatment. Chen was providing access to networks that could support military personnel and their families when circumstances required medical care that couldn't be obtained through traditional military or civilian healthcare systems. Treatment for injuries that might compromise ongoing operations if they were reported through official channels, or medical support for family members whose safety might be endangered if their connections to classified activities became known to hostile intelligence services. The final session of the medical conference focused on emergency preparedness and disaster response protocols, subjects that seemed mundane compared to the conversation I just concluded with Chen. But as I listened to presentations about triage procedures and resource allocation during mass casualty events, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what she'd demonstrated during her deployment to Afghanistan. Chen had shown that individual determination and creativity could accomplish objectives that normally required extensive resources and institutional support. She'd proven that medical training could provide cover for intelligence activities, but more importantly, she'd demonstrated that genuine care for human welfare could motivate people to take extraordinary risks in support of objectives that served larger purposes than personal advancement or professional recognition. Her brother had died trying to build networks that would help local populations resist Taliban oppression while providing intelligence that could save American lives. Instead of accepting his death as the end of that effort, she'd found ways to continue his work using her own skills and training. The pendant around her neck had contained more than coordinates and radio frequencies. It had contained the determination to ensure that his sacrifice accomplished something meaningful and lasting. During the flight back to Fort Benning, I found myself thinking about the students I'd be teaching in the coming months, young soldiers who were preparing for deployments where they'd encounter situations that couldn't be resolved through standard military procedures or conventional tactical approaches. Chen's story provided a framework for helping them understand that effectiveness in complex environments required more than technical competence or physical courage. The most successful military operations were often the ones that nobody recognized as military operations while they were happening. The most effective intelligence activities were conducted by people who appeared to be engaged in completely different kinds of work. The most valuable insights about human nature came from people who'd learned to see past surface appearances and recognize the complex motivations that drove individual behavior in extreme circumstances. 3 weeks after returning from the conference, I received an unexpected phone call from a former student who'd been deployed to Somalia as part of a humanitarian assistance mission. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, no relation to the Rodriguez I'd served with in Afghanistan, was calling about a situation that required advice from someone with experience in cultural assessment and threat evaluation. "Sir, we've got a medical situation here that doesn't fit normal protocols," she explained, her voice carrying the tension of someone dealing with circumstances that exceeded her training and experience. "Local clinic has been treating patients who come in with injuries that suggest combat experience, but they're supposed to be civilian refugees who've never been involved in fighting. The medical staff is starting to ask questions that might compromise operational security if the wrong people hear the answers." The situation Rodriguez was describing sounded familiar. People with capabilities and backgrounds that didn't match their apparent status as civilian refugees. Medical personnel were noticing inconsistencies between the patient's stated histories and the types of injuries they were presenting for treatment. Injuries that suggested military training and combat experience that couldn't be acknowledged without endangering their safety. "What kind of advice are you looking for?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve connecting her with resources that could provide specialized medical care while maintaining the operational security that her patients required. "We need someone who understands how to provide medical treatment without creating documentation that might be used to identify these people or compromise their safety," Rodriguez replied, her words confirming my assessment of the situation. "Standard military medical protocols require reporting certain types of injuries to intelligence personnel, but these patients can't be identified as having combat backgrounds without endangering their families who are still in areas controlled by hostile forces." I gave Rodriguez the contact information Chen had provided, explaining that she might be able to arrange medical support through networks that understood the security considerations involved in treating people whose backgrounds intersected with intelligence activities. The foundation Chen directed had experience handling exactly the type of situation Rodriguez was describing, providing medical care while maintaining the operational security that protected patients from retaliation by hostile intelligence services. 2 months later, Rodriguez called again to report that Chen's foundation had coordinated medical support for the refugee clinic in Somalia, providing training and resources that allowed local medical personnel to treat combat injuries without creating documentation that could be used to identify patients with military backgrounds. The assistance had been provided through international humanitarian organizations that maintained plausible cover for activities that served dual purposes of providing genuine medical care while supporting intelligence objectives. "Dr. Chen spent 2 weeks at the clinic," Rodriguez reported, her voice carrying admiration for someone who'd accomplished objectives that seemed impossible given the resource and security constraints. She trained the local medical staff on documentation procedures that protect patient confidentiality while still meeting international humanitarian standards. More importantly, she taught them how to identify and treat injuries that result from exposure to chemical weapons and other unconventional threats that most medical personnel never encounter. The training Chen had provided wasn't just about treating individual patients. It was about building sustainable medical capabilities that could continue operating in environments where traditional healthcare systems had been disrupted by conflict and political instability. Local medical personnel were now equipped to provide care that served both humanitarian and intelligence objectives, treating people who needed medical attention while gathering information that could be valuable for understanding regional security threats. Rodriguez's reports revealed another dimension of Chen's current activities that I hadn't fully understood during our conversation at the medical conference. The foundation she directed wasn't just providing medical care to refugees and immigrants in the United States. It was developing international networks of medical personnel who could operate in hostile environments while maintaining cover as humanitarian aid workers. "The impact has been significant," Rodriguez continued, providing details that illustrated the broader strategic value of Chen's approach to combining medical care with intelligence activities. "We're getting much better information about regional threat networks, because people trust medical personnel in ways they don't trust military or intelligence operatives. Families are willing to share information about missing relatives, unusual activities in their communities, and changes in local power structures when they're talking to someone who's treating their children's illnesses." 6 months after that conversation, I received a formal request from the Army Medical Command to develop curriculum for a new training program focused on medical operations in complex security environments. The program was designed to prepare medical personnel for deployments where providing healthcare might require understanding operational security, cultural sensitivity, and intelligence considerations that weren't covered in traditional medical education. The curriculum development process gave me access to case studies and operational reports that revealed the scope of activities being conducted by medical personnel who'd been trained in approaches similar to those Chen had demonstrated during her deployment to Afghanistan. Medical officers were serving as intelligence assets in dozens of countries, using their healthcare responsibilities as cover for activities that gathered information about regional threats while providing genuine medical services to local populations. Chen's foundation was referenced in several of the case studies as an organization that provided training and support for medical personnel operating in environments where traditional healthcare protocols might compromise operational security or patient safety. The Foundation's work was described as essential infrastructure for maintaining medical capabilities in regions where political instability made conventional healthcare delivery impossible. The training program I developed included modules on cultural assessment, threat evaluation, and operational security that were directly inspired by the lessons Chen had taught during her brief assignment to FOB Kestrel. Students learned to recognize that medical responsibilities could provide unique opportunities for gathering intelligence while serving humanitarian objectives that built trust and cooperation with local populations. The most effective medical operations in complex environments are the ones that serve multiple objectives simultaneously, I explained to my first class of students, young medical officers who were preparing for deployments where they'd encounter situations that required more than technical medical competence. Providing excellent healthcare builds trust and credibility that can be essential for accomplishing other objectives that serve national security interests. The students were initially skeptical about the idea that medical personnel could serve intelligence functions while maintaining professional medical ethics and humanitarian principles. Most of them had been trained to think of medical care and military operations as separate activities that should be kept distinct to preserve medical neutrality and protect healthcare workers from being targeted by hostile forces. Dr. Chen's story challenges that assumption, I continued, using her experience as a case study that illustrated how medical responsibilities could be combined with intelligence activities in ways that enhanced both objectives rather than compromising either one. She was able to provide excellent medical care while gathering intelligence that saved American lives and helped local populations resist oppression. The key was understanding that genuine care for human welfare could motivate people to share information they'd never provide to traditional intelligence operatives. The curriculum included practical exercises that taught students how to assess people and situations while maintaining the professional demeanor and ethical standards required for effective medical practice. Students learned to recognize indicators of combat experience, chemical weapons exposure, and other specialized medical conditions that might have intelligence value, while developing communication skills that encouraged patients to share information voluntarily rather than through interrogation or coercion. The goal isn't to exploit patients or manipulate them into providing information, I emphasized during every class session, ensuring that students understood the ethical framework that governed medical operations in complex environments. The goal is to build relationships based on genuine care and professional competence that create opportunities for voluntary information sharing that serves humanitarian and security objectives simultaneously. 5 years after developing that curriculum, I was promoted to senior instructor and given responsibility for training medical personnel who were being assigned to classified operations that officially didn't exist. The students in these programs had security clearances that allowed me to provide more specific details about operational methods and intelligence activities. But the fundamental principles remained the same as those Chen had demonstrated during her deployment. Medical personnel have unique access to information that traditional intelligence operatives can't obtain, I explained to one class of special operations medics who were preparing for assignments that would require them to operate under non-official cover in countries where American military presence wasn't officially acknowledged. People will share information with healthcare providers that they'd never reveal to anyone they perceived as military or intelligence personnel. Your medical credentials provide credibility and access that can be essential for accomplishing objectives that serve national security while genuinely helping people who need medical care. The students in these advanced programs were already experienced military medical personnel who understood the basics of operational security and tactical awareness, but they needed to learn how to apply those skills in environments where their success would depend on their ability to blend into civilian medical communities, while maintaining capabilities that could be activated when circumstances required intelligence gathering or other specialized activities. Dr. Chen's approach was successful because she never compromised her medical ethics or professional standards, I continued, using her story as an example of how intelligence activities could be conducted in ways that enhanced rather than undermined medical effectiveness. She provided excellent health care to everyone who needed it, regardless of their political affiliations or potential intelligence value. That commitment to genuine medical care was what gave her credibility and access that enabled her intelligence activities. The training included extensive practice, with scenarios that required students to make rapid assessments of people and situations, while maintaining medical focus and professional demeanor. Students learned to recognize when patients might have information that could be valuable for intelligence purposes, while developing communication skills that encouraged voluntary sharing without compromising medical trust or violating professional ethics. Chen's influence on military medical training extended far beyond the specific curriculum I'd developed. Her story had become part of the institutional knowledge that shaped how the Army approached medical operations in complex environments, providing a model for combining healthcare responsibilities with intelligence activities in ways that served multiple objectives simultaneously. 15 years after watching Dr. Sarah Chen walk out of the mess hall at FOB Kestrel, I finally understood what she'd been trying to teach us. The pendant around her neck hadn't just contained enemy coordinates. It had contained the understanding that courage and determination could transform individual tragedy into collective strength, that knowledge could be passed from one generation to the next through actions rather than words, and that the most powerful weapons against hatred and oppression were often carried by people who looked like they couldn't hurt anyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.